All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Elena Ionescu. Welcome to the 2023 Green Coffee Summit. I am the Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer at the Specialty Coffee Association, as well as one of your hosts for this year's digital event. So, when the SCA held our first Green Coffee Summit in the summer of 2021, I think it was August, that was a time of acute isolation. It seemed to many of us like we might never be able to meet in person again. But circumstances have changed in the intervening 2.5 years. However, the importance of making emerging knowledge available at no cost to green coffee buyers and sellers has not diminished. During this year's program, delivered across 2 days, we will be hearing from people who work in the center of the coffee value chain, like roasters and importers, as well as people who are more on the periphery, like research institutions, whose outside perspective enables the industry to see itself more clearly. We also want to hear from all of you, which is why we've set up the chat feature. So please, if you haven't already, take a moment to introduce yourselves. Let us know what led you to join us here today. Now, while our speakers and panelists are presenting, you should feel free to use that chat feature to share your reflections and, of course, to share all of your questions, which we want to hear. And the host, whether that's me or one of my colleagues, will put those questions to our speakers and our panelists at the end of their presentations, and they'll do their best to answer them. You might also find that one of your peers is able to advise you. If you miss something over the course of today or tomorrow, then try not to worry, because we're going to be recording all of these sessions and we'll put them all up in the resource library of the Green Coffee Summit site so that you're able to access them later. And we'll also populate that site with additional articles and talks and relevant resources of all types as we create them and come across them. So on the first day of the Coffee Summit, we're going to pick up a conversation that we actually started at this event last year, when a few of my colleagues and I introduced the coffee value assessment in a session that was focused on evolving the SCA cupping form. Today, we're going to dig into extrinsic attributes, what they are, why they're important, and how we might begin to assign value to them in a way that makes sense for buyers and sellers alike. After that, my colleague, Dr. Mario Fernandez Alduenda, will kick off a panel, which is recorded in Spanish, but then subtitled in English, exploring post-harvest processing as a lever for value addition. 2 years ago, Mario did a talk at this event in which he proposed that we are living through what he called a processing revolution. And it's only gained momentum since 2021. So if you haven't been paying attention, this is a great time to start, because this might be the area of the value chain where we are seeing the most innovation and creativity at the moment. After that, we're going to dig deeper into the role of intangible assets in determining the value of a product, under the guidance of Luis Fernando Samper, who quite literally wrote the book on intangibles in coffee. Luis is currently working with the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority and will be using geographic indications as a case study of an intangible asset that definitely plays a role in determining the value of the final coffee product. And then in our final session, we'll get thinking about inclusive business models and how green coffee buyers and sellers can adapt the business as usual practices to better meet the needs of specialty coffee segment, buyers, sellers, and even consumers for home relationships, and stories are drivers of value. So before I switch gears and take us into our first session, I want to thank all of the presenters and panelists who are sharing their time and experiences with us today. Also, the Green Coffee Summit would not be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. So thank you to title sponsor Barista Attitude, as well as to supporting sponsors BWT Water and More and Caravella Coffee. So like I said, I'm going to switch gears and go into presenter mode now, as opposed to host mode. Oh, I'm getting a note that my microphone is scratching. So I'm going to try to adapt that on the fly. Okay, so I'm going to now start talking about extrinsic attributes, which, as the title suggests, are pretty extraordinary. So let me find the content and slide time. All right. Okay, here we go. Okay, that looks good. So, extrinsic attributes. We're going to speak a little bit today about the limitations of the 2004 cupping system to start ourselves off, orient with what we know. We're going to talk about attributes. I'm not going to go deeply into the definition, but for people who may not be familiar with all of the work that's happened over the past year, we're going to focus, however, on extrinsic attributes because you can find more about sensory descriptive attributes in other talks. We'll also talk about some research applications of extrinsic attributes. I'm going to share the results of a recent survey that the SCA conducted about extrinsic attributes of the global coffee, specialty coffee network. And finally, we'll talk about why all of this matters. So here we go. Okay. So cupping. This is how we assess coffee's value. At least that's what cupping was designed to do, whether in those words or not. So we're going to do this, look at cupping by going back, not to the beginning of specialty coffee or to the beginning of cupping, but to the 2004 cupping system, the one that we're improving upon with the 2023 coffee value assessment. And that form grew out of ideas that were codified by Ted Lingle in the Coffee Cuppers Handbook, which was published in 1984. So the handbook integrated new ideas from the field of sensory science, which was still, relatively young at the time, into the century-old practice of cupping. It would take another 15 years or so to take shape as the SCA's cupping protocol and system, which settled out about 5 years after that. So let's imagine that we're coffee buyers in 2004, or coffee cuppers. In 2004, specialty coffee lots probably would have included some information for the cupper to use in understanding what they were tasting. It might have been something like this. We might know that the origin of the coffee was El Salvador, the country in which it was grown, that it was a washed processed coffee, and we might even know that the variety is the SL28 variety. As a cupper, I probably would have put that information in the notes section of the 2004 form. Or maybe I would have used the white space between the samples. It would be significant information to me in evaluating the coffee, but it didn't really belong in the cupping notes section, right? Because it wouldn't be about fragrance, aroma, or taste. So fast forward from here to 2023, and we have not only this data to work with, but also all of this. We've got types of shade here, types of soil listed. The nickname of the producer is in here. I mean, this is a lot of information that we have available to us these days. And that's way too much information to fit into this notes section, no matter how tiny the handwriting of the cupper may be. And more importantly, none of that information about where a coffee is produced and who produced it gets reflected in that single number, the final score. There's no scoring box for notes that contributes to that tally. So should that information be counted somewhere if it's valuable? I mean, if this is part of what makes specialty coffee special? And that brings us to this fundamental question of what is specialty coffee? And if you've asked the internet what is specialty coffee over the past decade or so, you've probably seen something kind of like this, or read a definition that relates to a score out of 100 points. This graph is really appealing because it situates specialty coffee in opposition to commercial coffee, for one, and that's sort of implied in the word specialty. It's also a pyramid, which is by its very nature exclusive. And, best of all, it offers sort of a shortcut over there on the left, which is the score for a coffee. So here it implies that a single number, 80, can kind of cut through all of the cultural and climatic context, all the diversity in coffee production and processing around the world, and make it possible for an individual to compare, any two products and to rank them. So, does that sound good? Yeah, maybe a little too good. Well, I would say that it is too good to be true if you think that this information, any of it, is relevant to determining the value of a particular coffee. And that brings us to the definition that the SCA published in 2021 to underpin the coffee value assessment, because cupping is a standard and standards are based on definitions. The definition here is that specialty coffee is a coffee or coffee experience that is recognized for its distinctive attributes, resulting in a higher value within the marketplace. So there are a couple of things here that I think are important, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. One of those ideas is this idea of attributes. So attributes are what we could call qualities or aspects of a particular product, in this case, coffee. And distinctive attributes differentiate one product from another and differentiate them from commodities, which are, by nature, not differentiated. So here we put attributes on a continuum where the more distinctive positive attributes a coffee accumulates, the more special it becomes. So instead of a pyramid, we have this continuum, or this, spectrum. So this is a depiction of how specialty coffee works in the marketplace of the present. We also divide them into two categories. So these properties of a particular product can be divided in a few different ways, and we put them into two categories of extrinsic and extrinsic. This is just one way of categorizing them. And the intrinsic attributes are the material attributes, or the aspects of the product that are inside or within it. So, for example, when we cup coffee, we're really looking at the intrinsic attributes of coffee, what it tastes like, especially if we're cupping coffees blind or without any information in order to avoid bias. But even in competitions in which cup quality and scores are paramount, those informational attributes are still significant. So in this particular study, 3 economists, Traore, Wilson, and Fields, studied the Cup of Excellence competitions, trying to explain the origin of cupping scores and their relationship to auction prices in these different contests. And what they found was really interesting, because it determined that fruity, floral, and sweet flavors are preferred by cuppers and buyers, and that's significant. But what was more significant is the fact that these symbolic attributes, more than flavor attributes, are the main determinants of price. So it's those extrinsic attributes that are really influencing people when it comes time to assign value to coffee. And that's important, because the value of the coffee is the other part of this definition. So attributes can be measured. We can define specialty coffee in terms of attributes, and then with an individual coffee, measure whether or not it possesses an attribute. Say it's a fruity attribute. The coffee has it or it doesn't have it. So that makes it easier to do research on. Also, the value of attributes can be measured, like Traore and his colleagues did. And this makes the system, as I noted a minute ago, compatible with scientific research for the first time, because we're able to measure the presence of an attribute and then also measure whether or not that attribute garners additional value. So the score is not enough. Knowing that the coffee is distinctive, that it's crossed a particular threshold, is in and of itself not enough if it doesn't receive additional value for having those distinctive attributes. So we know that different cultures value different attributes for all sorts of reasons. Might be history, food ways. We'll hear more about these different cultures and different ways of assigning value and preferences from other speakers of ours over the next couple of days. So let's go back to this slide. And now that we've talked a little bit about what attributes are and intrinsic attributes in the context of cupping and flavor discovery, let's focus on the extrinsic attributes side of this slide. And for that, I'm going to go to this axiom of the specialty coffee industry, which you've probably heard before. This idea that it's what's in the cup that matters. And as we just learned in this study of the cup of excellence, it does matter, but maybe that's not all that matters. And so the next couple of slides, I'm going to refer you to resources where you can read more about all of the other things that matter from researchers who are studying this exact question. One of them found now that what you know about a coffee matters. This is a feature from 25, our biannual publication, that confirms that the presence of an extrinsic attribute, just knowing that there is information available about a coffee, changes the way that a consumer's brain perceives coffee while they're tasting it. Another piece from 25 is written by a professor, Nizam Abdu, who explores the findings of a meta-analysis of research on different kinds of eco-labels, exploring whether consumers are willing to pay more for a coffee that's eco-labeled over a coffee that's not. So that suggests that what you care about also matters in your perception of the value of a coffee. Even the SCA's own consumer research confirms the importance of extrinsic attributes. So consumer studies that we undertook in 2013 and 2016, showed this growing consumer interest in coffee's origin, sustainability attributes like organic certification, and fairness attributes. And, lest it seem like it's sort of a dichotomy, intrinsic is important or extrinsic is important. I'll pull out this graphic from one of those consumer studies. I think it was the 2016 study. Here we can see that description of flavor combinations expected is still the thing that more specialty coffee consumers across these three different categories are interested in than anything else. But that doesn't mean that they are not also interested in the description of the origin and sourcing, or the description of the coffee's sustainability in terms of different social, environmental, and economic standards. Just imagine that, like, if you're a coffee roaster or coffee retailer, that 20 to 30% of your customers are interested in knowing this information. That's a pretty significant percentage. So it's not only what's in the cup. Now let's talk about how this works in a research context. I'm going to be using a few slides borrowed from Dr. Fabiana Carvalho, who is a collaborating researcher at the University of Campinas in Brazil. And through her coffee sensorium, she is studying multisensory flavor perception. Here, she's speaking about this research at RICO. And the research I'm talking about is actually ongoing through the Coffee Science Foundation, supported by Savor Brands. And in this research, we're looking into coffee packaging and the color of coffee packaging and the impact that has on consumer perceptions of coffee flavors and consumer willingness to pay. So consumers who participated in an online survey first were given the same coffee to drink, which you can see a little bit about here on the slide. And the difference in the coffee was the color of the bag they were given to interact with, either pink or brown, and then with two different levels of color saturation. The graph on the left here shows that before tasting the coffee, consumers expected coffee in the pink bag to be sweeter and more acidic, and coffee in the brown bag to be more bitter. And then in the graph on the right, you see that perceptions are less significantly different than expectations, but that they're still not exactly the same. So I think it's interesting to note that with the exception of the acidic descriptor and the brown package, people had higher perceptions of all of these sensory attributes if they were able to interact with the package versus being in the control group that tasted coffee but weren't also presented with a bag of coffee. And here's where it gets really interesting, to me at least, because it gets into this question of value and attaching an attribute to value in a monetary sense. So that's why all this extrinsic stuff is important to green coffee buyers and sellers, because in this case, the color of the bag impacts what people are willing to pay. So it's the same coffee inside, but a dollar difference in perceived value per 12 ounce or 340 gram package. So now let's get back to the coffee value assessment, shall we? Like I said at the beginning, there's more information available in other talks about the descriptive and affective assessments, as well as a little bit about the physical assessment, which is still in an earlier phase of development. For today, we're going to be sticking mostly with the extrinsic. So the extrinsic assessment of the coffee value assessment is envisioned as a place to record additional information about a coffee that may contribute to its value, including identity, information, and sustainability attributes. So we presented a alpha version of this extrinsic assessment when we launched the descriptive and affective forms in April. And in this assessment, we have 4 different categories. It's probably too small on your screen to see it really well. It's a list of attributes divided into 4 categories with one sort of catch-all for other. And then after we introduced people to this idea, started taking some feedback anecdotally and through our early adopter form, we decided to do a broader survey to see which of these attributes people found most important and which ones maybe we had missed. So in August of this year, we launched an online survey around the world in English and Spanish and Korean of the extrinsic assessment, the alpha version, to take feedback. It was open for about 2 months, and during that time, we got about 800 responses. These came from people all across the value chain. We had a higher concentration of retailers and roasters, which is not surprising really for any SCA survey. But there were respondents from all of the different categories that we gave people to choose from among. And, here's what we found in that survey, was that for some attributes, there was a high degree of agreement. So if we start on the left side there, what we can see in this box plot is that pretty much everyone who responded to the survey agreed that processing was an important extrinsic attribute. This is something that people, regardless of their affiliation in the supply chain, business type, number of years in the industry, this is something that people wanted to know about. Same thing goes for the origin of the coffee. Then as we move from left to right, you can see that, you get into some attributes where there's not quite as much consensus, like, the process description or the size grade. To some people, that's really important. That's why they're scoring it up there at 9 along the vertical axis. But to other people, that's not super significant information. They're putting it down at a 5. And so you've got a greater spread in the responses that came in. And as we keep moving from left all the way over to the right, you start to see some attributes that people think, at least respondents, think are maybe not quite as important to them. Maybe not ranking down at the level of 1, but not something that people are prioritizing. And that might be something like a second party verification or the ICO number. These are things that comparatively are not as significant to this group of respondents as far as extrinsic attributes are concerned. We also broke this down by business type. We found that to different businesses, some of these attributes are more and less important. So for a consumer, something like organic certification is an important attribute to know. And that's less important to, say, an importer or an association. Maybe that's information that they take for granted. Consumers are not as interested in something like the other grade or the name of the wet mill. Those are things that are much more important to importers, people who are in the middle of the coffee supply chain. So not all attributes are equally important to all audiences. And that's something that we want to be conscious of as we think about cupping, first of all, as a tool for the green coffee trade, for green coffee evaluation. But we also know that cupping is increasingly applied in all sorts of different contexts all around the world, including in coffee retail businesses, as a tool for educating coffee consumers. When we think about this, evaluation mechanism, we can think about this as being used in conjunction with cupping, but also being used in all sorts of different ways with all of these different audiences. We also found in the survey that there are some idiosyncratic roles. For example, the processor. People who identified themselves as processors had different opinions of what was important, and they seemed to rank the importance of many of these attributes lower than some of the other the actor types here. This one is a study on, or this one we're looking at organic certification, and to processors, organic certification is significantly less important than it is to pretty much every other respondent type in this survey. So we don't know yet why this group is idiosyncratic, but again, it supports this recognition that not all business types and not all actors are going to have the same sense of what should be assessed and what the relative value is. There are also a few interesting correlations that came out of this survey. One is that there's an inverse correlation between the years of experience that someone has in coffee and the importance of varieties to them. So someone who is newer to the coffee industry sees varieties as particularly important, and the longer someone spends in coffee, the comparatively less important varieties become to them to know. We can speculate about why that is. It may be that they are thinking about varieties like you might think about grape varieties in wine, that this is something that's going to be really important to determining the final product. And then as they go on in their journey, they realize that their post-harvest processing changes the flavor, or there's the roasting to consider. So another one is that there's a direct correlation between the years of experience someone has in coffee and the importance that they see of the other grade, which is something like, strictly high grown, strictly hard bean, Kenya AA. That may be a function of these other grades having been really important, especially before the emergence of the SCA's standard in 2004. Before it was as easy as it is now to make comparisons and have access to all of these different coffees to compare. These size grade designations were really significant attributes. So if someone has been in the industry for a long time, they may recall when those were some of the only attributes that we as cuppers had to go on. We also found that respondents from coffee producing countries place a high importance on variety. And we have responses from coffee importers, coffee exporters, as well as from retailers and roasters in coffee producing countries. It's not only from producers, but imagining that probably the higher proportion of the respondents in producing countries are going to be producers. Variety is something that is within a producer's control, and something that they may want to use as part of their brand or part of their value proposition to a prospective buyer. So having concluded this survey, the next work that we have to do is to take all of this feedback and incorporate it into a beta version of this form. So we're expecting to launch a beta version of the extrinsic form in 2024, which we will share with the broader industry, with all of you, for testing and feedback like we've been doing this year, 2023, with the descriptive and effective forms. So, while we're exploring extrinsic attributes, if I haven't done this already, I want to really bring it back to why all of this matters. I think it matters because this is not how we sell coffee, right? Or at least this is not how we sell specialty coffee. We know, as I said before, that different coffees, different cultures value different attributes in their coffee. And we don't necessarily need to agree on the value of organic certification, for example. But we can, as an industry, and we should strive to build a shared understanding of the extrinsic attributes that are valuable. And we have some experience doing this already. The World Coffee Research Sensory Lexicon underpins the 2016 Coffee Tasters Flavor Wheel. It's not difficult to imagine that we might create a lexicon for extrinsic attributes once we've done some research to inform the development process. So just as an example, an extrinsic attributes wheel could look something like this. We've got certifications, post-harvest process. It's a step toward a common language that helps us to develop a common understanding of value. So it's not enough to know that these things are important. We also want to know how important they are and to whom. And if we have that information, that common language can help us to address information asymmetry, which is one of the goals of the coffee value assessment and the goal of the SCA's sustainability agenda. For all sorts of reasons, not everyone in the coffee system has access to the same information. The global coffee industry is diverse and it's expansive, as this systems map depicts. And honestly, this is nowhere near comprehensive. So in the context of all of this diversity, having a common language or languages for sensory attributes, extrinsic attributes, is particularly important to ensuring specialty coffee can be this thriving, equitable, sustainable activity for the whole value chain, that central column of this map. And one more circular diagram, and then I promise that I'll wrap this up and we can get into more of a discussion about this. So, expert cuppers have diverse preferences, as anyone who's been part of cuppings in different companies and different parts of the world knows. But we also understand that our preferences are only kind of a small portion of the preferences of coffee consumers globally. This chart here is a principal component analysis. It's one way of trying to understand the relationships between data points in complicated data sets, like consumer preference mapping. So this belongs to a researcher named Dr. Helena Hopfer, based on work that she did in wine. So on the left in white, you can see what wine experts preferred. And then the one on the right, with all of these colors going in all of these different directions, is what consumers prefer. So these 4 assessments, including cupping, but also including an assessment of the physical coffee and an assessment of all of the extrinsic attributes that a coffee possesses, all of this information that is now available to us. All of this is intended to work together as a multifaceted value discovery tool. They don't all need to be used together all the time, but they can be, and they all add something and reflect something about specialty coffee, how it's bought, sold, valued in 2023. And so when we bring this together and we look at the future, we believe that if we can measure what is valued in coffee, we can understand how and when and where value is generated. And, we We can also understand where that value is currently being captured. Then once we understand where value is captured, we can see where the distribution, how the distribution looks, where that may be unequal. And it gives us a better chance at distributing value more equitably, which puts us on that path to securing a future for the entire industry. An important thing in this is that the tool that we have created is an open access tool. So there will be courses available, there are already, but using the tool, familiarizing yourself with it will always be something that the SCA is committed to making available to everyone. And that brings me to what happens next. So focusing more specifically on extrinsic attributes in 2024 and beyond. As I said a minute ago, we're going to be taking the extrinsic attributes form and putting that into more of a beta version to get user feedback. Meanwhile, the descriptive and effective forms will be going through the standard development process for official adoption. We're looking to do some research, including on the value of different extrinsic attributes in different markets, both from the perspective of experts like cuppers, as well as from a consumer perspective. So we're going to be planning to launch that in 2024. And then once that research is complete, the extrinsic attributes form would also go through that same standard approval process. And we would hope to have something, ready to launch in 2025 if I'm being ambitious. Right now, I'll put this QR code up for anyone who has not already signed up to become an early adopter of the coffee value assessment. You can find plenty of information in this sca.coffee/value assessment/CVA early adopter. Take you to a bunch of different places, including to the full version of the draft protocol. It's a pretty extensive document, but you can really dig into extrinsic attributes there and get a whole lot more detail than I have been able to provide today. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm going to welcome one of my colleagues, another collaborator in this coffee value assessment process, Jen Rugolo, to bring in some questions from the chat, or create some questions if it's a quiet group, and we'll take it from there. All right. I have a question, which while I'm waiting for my co-presenter, I will read. Okay. In the depiction of the attributes continuum, it suggests that if you increase the number of attributes, you can move a coffee from commercial to specialty. If the attributes increase is predominantly on the extrinsic side, does this not shift the true definition of quality away from intrinsic? Should the weight of intrinsic quality not be higher than extrinsic in terms of the SCA's definition of specialty? That's a good question. And, for the SCA, attributes are attributes. And as long as they're valued, then they contribute to a coffee being more special and more specialty. So those examples of research that I put up there as sort of as background reading, those suggest that extrinsic attributes aren't necessarily less valuable than intrinsic attributes, that a lot of it really depends on the consumer, on the buyer. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that might change. As long as the value is there, then it qualifies. Hey, Jen.
Hi, Kim. Sorry about that. I think my computer is a little overprotective of me sometimes. So thanks for jumping right in there. I also noted that Peter responded to that question in the chat very well. And his sort of his take on it, which he pointed out was his take, but I think is also a little bit our take, is this idea that we as the SCA shouldn't be setting sort of what is valuable, but that we want consumers to be able to do, or like everyone should be able to sort of set that on their own a little bit. And I thought that was another way of saying what you just said, but I think in a
more
just
concise,
kind of like hammer that home a bit. Yeah. I have so many questions here in the chat. I've been trying to document them all so that we have enough time to move through them. I noticed, for instance, that some of the chat members have raised other extrinsic attributes, things like water activity, UV light, QC parameters as being important. And I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit how the beta version of the form will sort of work. So will there be room for users to write down the things that are important to them in addition to what we're asking them to sort of capture there?
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's something that would be true with any form, whether we're talking about the descriptive form, the extrinsic form, maybe even the affective form, although maybe a little bit less so there. But when we're trying to profile a coffee, there's no way that we can possibly capture every single attribute that would be valuable to every single evaluator. So we make some choices, like we did with the descriptive form, about certain flavors of the flavor wheel to include, because there's not space for all of them. And we'll have to make some of those same decisions about the extrinsic form whenever we reach that point of a final version. But having space for people to add those freely elicited extrinsic attributes, the descriptions of what's important to them, I think would be critical, because sometimes these things change, like water activity. I'm old enough to remember when that wasn't a thing that people talked about. I'm definitely old enough to remember when a lot of the post-harvest processes that we see now were not things that really existed in kind of common parlance. So I'm glad for the chance to evolve those. And I think that also sort of speaks to the frequency with which we want to be in the future, adapting the system and adopting new versions. Oh, I've got to hold my mic. And adopting new versions, because we're just going to keep seeing things change. It's not like we're going to get it right and set it in 2023 and then not come back to it for another 20 years. I think we've learned a lesson about 19 years being like a little bit too long.
There we go. Sorry. No, I agree. 19 years is a little bit too long, and I'm excited about the fact how having that freely elicited descriptor space is actually going to allow us to also see sort of how those things are changing over time, and maybe integrate them into some of those kata boxes across the different assessments, so that we might be able to really sort of see these things happen as we go. There are some really, really good questions, but there's one that before we sort of dive into, I think, some of the more nitty gritty things that people want to talk about here. Someone has asked you to give an outlook on the upcoming research on value. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that before we get into some of the big things.
Oh man, this has been something I'm actually really excited about, the kind of strategic shift that we are making with some of our research to invest in doing some of this value research, because for the past, let's say, 3 or 4 years, we've been talking to the industry, talking to individual companies about our desire to research value. And that's driven by this sustainability agenda that we really codified after the 2019 Price Crisis Response Initiative concluded. And it's tough, value is abstract, and research, and sometimes, people who are excited about doing research want to have some like really kind of concrete conclusions that they come to. So with a project like this, it's been tricky to really kind of build momentum for it, and the opportunity of the value assessment, and especially of the intrinsic portion of the value assessment, gives us the chance to really the trigger, the kick in the pants to start to do it. So we don't have a research partner for that yet. We haven't issued an RFP, but I'm really excited to do that, and you'll all hear about that when we do.
Yeah. This, I think, segues nicely into one of the questions we got, which is articulating a concern that the definition of quality and value is coming more from the global north. I see some folks flagging up that they saw only 45 producers participated in this particular survey, and just sort of wondering, are we asking producers what they consider to be valuable or high quality? Sort of segueing into that value research a little bit, I know we do have the results of another survey, which is not related to the coffee value assessment, but is related to sort of the structural reasons why we started to do this work. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to sort of how the process around the coffee value assessment, where we've tried to address some of this information asymmetry and historic power imbalance, but also how some of the other things that we've been doing, like, I don't know, if we want to talk a little bit about the equitable value distribution survey here, but to me, there's a little bit of a connection in terms of who we're talking to and where this is all coming from. Sometimes I think it's not readily apparent, and just to talk through that a bit.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point about anytime we do an online survey, especially as a majority like English language communicating organization, we do get more respondents from the global north and more respondents, more responses in English. And so to kind of counter that, for some of the work that we've been doing, including this survey on value distribution, which you alluded to, and which we're in the process of putting, final touches on a report about. We did a kind of special, like, in-person, more like open-ended discussion session with focus groups of producers, because we knew that was going to be a hard thing to capture, even with translation, even with the support of institutional partners in coffee producing countries who are distributing the survey to their members. So that's one mechanism, is, sort of a focus group approach to complement this. In the case of the value assessment, it's actually, I think probably would surprise some people to learn that the initial pilot cuppings that we did and the, feedback that informed the development of what we launched this year has been very producer centric. So, more producers participated in pilot cuppings probably than, green coffee buyers did. And that's very intentional, because the open access tool aspect of this and the, distribution of value aspect of this are what, led us to have an extrinsic evaluation form at all. So the 2021 survey of coffee cuppers around the world, users of the SCA cupping form, many of those respondents, including, hundreds of respondents from coffee producing countries, flagged that having a place to write down these descriptors, some of the things that were not captured by the cupping form, would be really, really critical to any kind of update to the process.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have the value distribution survey out soon to sort of share some of this from another perspective as well. But it's been a really long process, and I know that because we've been working on it for so long, over definitely more than 3 years, but sort of solidly 3 years, that sometimes we feel like it's very clear that how much sort of thought and intentionality has gone into doing this off the back of the Price Crisis Response Initiative, and that we really are trying to make sure that we're including the voices that need to be heard. Gonna try and I, like I said, more questions. We have some really good ones here. I'm gonna start working through them, but we are going to get to them, and we have about 10 minutes before our next presentation. So if you have any other questions, now is the time to add them into the chat. One question that we got in is sort of, the SEA has defined what specialty coffee is. Some organization will have to regulate, police, guide, or lead what specialty coffee is. Who else can protect the consumer from those companies that use the overuse of extrinsic qualities to overvalue coffee that is of a low intrinsic value?
This is, man, I feel like there are about 3 questions in that one. One is about this kind of regulatory body, which, one of the things that I've said a lot over the course of the past year or two, since we've started talking about specialty coffee in terms of attributes and value versus in terms of a point score and a number of defects in a green coffee sample, is that the SCA was never regulating the use of specialty coffee. So there are, plenty of companies out there who use that term, who many of you, maybe all of you on this call would collectively agree should not be using that, that phrase for whatever reason. But that's not how we see our role. We set standards, but we don't certify people to or force members of ours to use these standards that we put out there. So these are tools for the industry, and it's part of our responsibility as a trade association. But we don't see ourselves as a regulator. As to whether or not there's a need for that, I think that companies are going to, make choices about whether and how to apply this idea to their businesses, and that it could end up that specialty coffee looks a lot of different ways. I think it already does, though. I think that, what you're describing in the future exists already in the present. And that's part of the growth. That's part of what's driven the growth of specialty coffee around the world. So the industry's gotten a lot bigger. That's consumption in sort of traditional consuming markets, but it's also coffee consumption in, markets that didn't drink a lot of coffee, didn't drink specialty coffee at all, maybe, 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And the SCA is an association for all of those markets, not only for the kind of traditional, giants of coffee consumption.
Yeah. Speaking of that, someone I see has referenced sort of things that maybe once upon a time were very valuable on sort of the extrinsic side and maybe have changed a little bit over time, and how our own preferences have changed. So someone has asked, would you ever imagine a time when aged coffees with all of their extrinsic qualities could find their way back into the specialty coffee pantheon? Referencing Old Brown Java, Indian Monsoon Malabar. Yeah.
Oh man, this is for speaking for myself. I can totally imagine that. I mean, I feel like everything, comes back around at some point. I personally am not going to make that my cause celeb, and sort of throw my weight behind popularizing it. But I also think that gets to something that, forgive me for sort of hammering on this point, but that is really important about the current definition of specialty coffee, which is that if there's additional value there, if someone values that coffee, then I want everyone who's involved in the creation of that product, to be able to access that additional value. I don't want my particular opinion of those coffees to keep someone who creates them from being rewarded for something that a buyer wants to buy. So it does mean that we're kind of we're really leaning into diversity and to inclusiveness, and to this idea that, if someone likes this and is willing to pay for it, then that's a match that we want to make between a buyer and a seller.
And for those who are sort of trying to find ways of integrating this into their business, they're sort of seeing the concept, they understand the logic, but okay, so how do we practically sort of integrate this into what we're doing? Do you have any recommendations? Is this something we're still learning as we go?
Yeah, I mean, to focus on extrinsic attributes, which is, I tried to make my focus today. I think that starting to catalog these, whether or not you use the SCA's alpha version of the extrinsic form or something of your own design, whether you modify the cupping form that you use in your company or create something different, maybe you're not a cupper, but just start to kind of note which of these attributes are things that are important to you. You could even do this as a coffee consumer. What is it that you want to know about your coffee? And if you want to know it, then within that list of attributes, which one of those feel more important or more critical to your brand, and go from there.
Yeah. I wonder, I'm just, now that we're sort of course, I asked for more questions, and now I have all these questions coming in, and we have about 6 minutes left. So I'm going to try and maybe mush some of these together a little bit. So we have one question that is asking sort of why we're moving away from intrinsic quality and to expand to extrinsic quality. And then another that is asking about the sort of whether or not there's anything within CVA to undermine the power imbalances in assigning value. And I kind of see a relationship between these two, and wondering if there's a way to sort of answer both of them in the time we have left.
Yeah. I think that, the moving away from the focus on intrinsic is, that's what both the research examples that I used, and then also if you go back to like last year's presentation and we go into this user study that I already referenced, like sort of 20 years of use of the cupping form and all of these stakeholder interviews and survey responses, reinforce the idea that, it's not just research that says that this stuff is important. It's also cuppers who say that this stuff is important. People who are using the cupping form want to value extrinsic attributes, want a way to include this information. So I would say that's the reason why. It's not that intrinsic information is no longer important. It's just that extrinsic attribute information is also really important. Sometimes equally so, sometimes, simultaneously. We just need a way to do this also. And then the power imbalance thing, and I would say that I personally have been, I spent late nights thinking about who owns like farm data, who gets in we have a speaker who's going to talk about this in a couple sessions, but, who does that belong to? Who gets the value from that? And so having a way to catalog that information makes it part of the negotiation, puts it on the table that this is something that requires attention. And if it's something that requires attention, and if we can do some research that starts to attach some, sort of common ideas around value to it, even again, if it's not that every buyer agrees that there's a premium of a certain amount for a certain attribute, if we can start to recognize those attributes, then it becomes a tool that a seller can use in their negotiation in a way that we have seen, flavor attributes and coffee varieties like geisha have become those kind of tools. So like, it would be great if there were even more of those, and it wasn't just geisha and just, carbonic maceration, and we could have a whole, range of those that really reflects all of the buyers out there who value not only geisha and carbonic maceration, but a bunch of other extrinsic information as well.
I remember having a conversation with some folks who were feeding back on it and basically saying that, well, they were sort of like, there's a lot to wrap my head around here, but really what I'm excited about is that there's so much more space for me to write down that information, so that it's not just the single number, so that I can have a conversation. Because when somebody sort of flatly lays down this is an 84 and that's it, that there's not much you can sort of work with there if you're trying to sort of negotiate something better for yourself as a producer. But if you have lots of information documented, that maybe that opens the door a little bit. All right, well, with 2 minutes to spare, wondering if you have anything else that you'd like to sort of leave with people, or if there's something that you're particularly excited about when it comes to this extrinsic assessment, or that's on your mind.
I guess I'll leave on a slightly personal note and say that ever since I got into coffee, which was 20 years ago now, I feel like the people and the sort of stories of where coffee comes from and how it's grown have been a huge part of keeping me in specialty coffee and in the coffee industry, and seeing the growth in the appreciation for extrinsic attributes has been super exciting to witness and be part of for 2 decades. So the idea that we're at a point now where we can codify that a little bit more and recognize that collectively we want this to play a role in how specialty coffee is seen beyond the flavors that we all love, because I love my coffee flavors too. That to me just sort of speaks to the potential for kind of the dawning of a new era. So yeah, it's like it just feels very cool to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kim.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. Thanks all for great questions, and I'll see you on a future session.